Good morning, Daniel.
Good morning, Dan.
Actually, it occurs to me it's the afternoon, so in a rare turn of events, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'll find it in my heart to forgive you for the mistake.
Unforgivable lapse of time and judgment.
So, what's going on? What are we talking about today?
Well, I just flew back in this morning from the FPA Shift conference, which for obviously most people aren't going to be aware of that, but that is a gathering of the Financial Planning Association, and that is just a conference for advanced financial planners. Pretty much everybody there owns a firm, owns a practice as a lead planner or as a top academic or something like that in the field. And I think we just sit down and chat a little bit about kind of what some of the takeaways and discussions are at the cutting edge of financial planning. Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it.
All right. Sounds like a pretty good set of topics for the day. So, what did you learn? What do you want to start with?
I think the first thing that comes up in this is probably in the domain of client psychology. One of the presenters was Dr. Megan McCoy, who's a nationally recognized expert on financial therapy and client psychology, particularly around couples and kind of money conflicts and stressors and those sorts of things. She was presenting on the challenge that couples can face in having discussions about money and how that extends into the practice of planning and how that interacts at the intersection of client well-being and how planners can contribute or potentially detract from that well-being if things are not done well and handled correctly.
Money is a pretty big deal. Probably something a lot of couples should be talking about. Was this conversation mainly stemming around bad things that come up when people talk about it, or ways to improve the conversations you have with your spouse?
They sort of started with this idea, just some sort of basic psychology literature on relationships. Couples need kind of a ratio of like five good things to one bad thing in their relationship to be happy. You can't, in a perfect world, you might be 10 to 1 or 20 to 1, but you need this baseline of at least like five compliments, nice things, pleasant conversations, etc., to a ratio of one, rude thing or inconsiderate thing or, sharing a bad thing or whatever that is to sort of to maintain an optimal balance in a relationship. And again, you can have more than that, but that's sort of the de minimis requirement. And one of the things that came up as part of that is many couples will avoid discussing money issues or problems until they are actual problems. Like they just don't talk about money conversationally or about like their goals or their objectives or money related topics until or unless a problem occurs, and that creates two problems. One, suddenly we're talking about money in a negative light. And then two, the longer term trend issue, we're only ever talking about money when something's bad is happening. And that can create this negative assumption or this negative association with the subject of finances in general, which then can sort of compound psychologically and lead to more and more sort of negative framing around financial topics, such that couples draw this deeply negative association with money and are not likely to have proactive or positive conversations about money because they have these negative associations.
All right, so I'm picking up two things here. It sounds like one, be more proactive in these conversations as opposed to reactive, and sort of talk about things before they're an issue. And it also sounds like include more positive conversations about money to, you don't have to measure the ratio, but to have more positive than more negative discussions so that maybe you frame those conversations as not always dreadful, but sometimes it can actually be an improvement and fun for people.
And in that particular sense, an example that Dr. McCoy shared was the idea of a lottery date. She proposes that couples maybe once a quarter, twice a year, go and buy a lottery ticket. And like it'd be great if you won, but you're not really buying it to win, right? It doesn't really work that way. But the idea here is that you share the experience of going to the that corner store, you buy the lottery ticket, and you go out to dinner or go have an experience together, and you use the lottery ticket as sort of the impetus to have a what if conversation. What if we won? What would our lives be different? What would we want to do if we had more abundance in our lives financially? Would we keep working? Would we change our careers? Would we grow our family? Would we live somewhere else, etc.? And it sort of just provides this easy framework to have a comfortable, positive discussion about if money wasn't an issue for us, in whatever way money may or may not be an issue for any couple, what would or could or should or can we do with and about that? Right. And so that's sort of just a basic idea of creating opportunities to have positive money conversations that don't serve a functional purpose in terms of like we're not talking about the budget or we're not talking about the bills, we're not talking about how we're drowning in debt or something. We're just talking about money in this warm sense of abundance. And that's a thing a lot of couples fail to engage in.
I think that's useful. However, there has to be some sort of way to talk about money in a positive light too that doesn't require living in like a something that's not reality, right? It's like what if, right? Like how do you have these conversations if, it's like yeah, it's great to potentially win the lottery and have those conversations and that could be exciting. But for a lot of people too, it's just like hey, we're just trying to get by, right? And you can have that conversation one time, two times, three times, but at a certain point you probably need a little more too, right? Like how does someone who's maybe grounded in reality, bring positivity into these conversations with their spouse.
Well, I mean, that's I think sort of an interesting thing because to some extent, there's the practical stuff. There's the budget conversation, there's the bills, there's the what are you saving for retirement thing. And any of these things, whether it be even proactive or reactive or positive or negative, can be stressors. Right. You think something like a conversation about saving for retirement would just be intrinsically good. We're going to save more money for retirement. We're going to build wealth. That's good. But maybe that triggers a sense of scarcity for one of the spouses where oh, I want you to max out your 401k. And what they hear when their spouse says that is not we're going to build wealth together. What they hear is my paycheck's going to get really small and I'm not going to have money to spend, even if we collectively have a strong income or a lot of wealth, right? That I am not going to be able to do quite as well as I intended or wanted to. That is problematic. That is a challenge that needs to be accounted for or accommodated reasonably. And I think one of the things that Dr. McQuay brought up is that a lot of therapists today are sort of trained to treat money stressors as uncontrollable. Right? They're not finance experts or specialists, so they're talking to clients as if their money problems are a property of physics. You have money problems. Let's not talk about the money. Let's just talk about the stressors in your life and the conflicts or problems this is causing for you. And then, with that all discussed, we will have nothing to say about the core problem itself, which is the money issue or the money conflict.
So where do you see our role in helping, clients where there's two partners improve? Like, do you think our role in this is to help with some of the encouragement or to just simply be present for these conversations so that they occur?
I think it's an opportunity for us to evaluate what our scope of relationship as financial planners is. And there was a framework that was recommended for this, which was essentially the problem check, the client check, the self check. You want to say, okay, is the problem we're discussing in this conversation a financial planning problem? Is it a savings rate? Is it a rate of return? Is it a risk management? Is it an estate problem? Is it a technical problem, first and foremost? Let's say it's not a technical problem. Okay, is the client unable to effectively discuss the issue in some way, shape, or form? Or is it a couple and one of them is saying, well, we should put money into this account, and the other one's saying, no, we shouldn't, and they just go round and round and round, and they're not speaking to each other. Okay, the client's having an issue here. And then the third stage is, okay, am I within my scope of confidence and scope of comfort? Or does this seem to me like a problem that does not fall into my planning scope? And a critical element there to really evaluate that last one, because sometimes uncomfortable conversations are easy for people to just want to avoid. I don't love that conversation. I love that topic. I'm going to push back on that or I'm going to create space from that. And in turn, as they've done that or as they do that, they're sort of deferring that to somebody else. But if the problem's not a planning problem and the client is not able to resolve or discuss that problem constructively, and you are not able to advise or discuss or assist with that problem constructively, then the natural and ethical thing is to recommend a specialist like a financial therapist to be able to help them have a more productive conversation.
All right. Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think the same rule applies to people who aren't yet, married and joining finances, or do you think you start having some of these conversations and maybe the positive interactions around money before you actually need to?
Well, I think you wanna have conversations, proactively all the time, right? This is sort of where you come back to the idea of, like, the lottery date, just as one example of it, but, like, there's no, "Oh gosh, I see some financial stress in the future. Why don't we go buy a lottery ticket and talk about it?" Like, it's this regular repeat ritual of let's have constructive humanistic conversations about money or about our finances as a couple, as a household, or with our children or with our parents, right? It doesn't just have to be couples before there's a problem. Let's have this constructive relationship with it rather than leaving money discussions as only reactive to problems and negative events.
Awesome. Anything else on this topic?
I think there's just one call out that I kind of got a laugh out of, but it was just something to help with the framing of financial issues because often financial issues are cast in blame terms, like you overspend, you are not responsible with money, you are not following the budget. But the framework that Dr. McQuay recommended is looking through something called the actor observer bias, which is recognizing that we tend to give our choices and our actions context. And we tend to ascribe other people's actions, particularly negative actions, to them as character flaws. So she gives the example of, you are driving and you have to tailgate somebody for some reason because maybe you got to like squeeze in a zipper merge or you're trying to like make an exit or something. And you're just like, hey, I'm just trying to get where I'm going. I wouldn't normally do this, but it is what it is. And at the same time, if somebody tailgates you, you're like, who raised you and who taught you to drive? You are such a terrible person for tailgating me so aggressively, you awful, awful person in the other car. And in the case of a money thing, the trick there is to then take a step back and say, okay, if you are if somebody in your relationship, your life, even if it's yourself, right? If you can't find a reason to empathize or recognize what they're doing, if you can't look at them through a humanistic lens and say, everybody's doing the best they can and all their behaviors serve a purpose, not always a constructive purpose or a good purpose, but it serves a purpose. People don't do things for no reason, literally. Then you want to kind of take a step back and say, okay, I'm giving myself the benefit of the doubt in some context. What context am I not giving this person or this person's actions, an opportunity for me to understand and better relate to how or why they might have done something?
I could think of probably 100 examples of me doing just that, and I will make sure the next time I'm driving that when someone cuts me off, I'll say they're doing the best they can, and I'm sure there's a reason.
You just gotta see the good in everybody, right?
All right, what else you got? Were there any more tips on my driving in the presentations here?
No, not on your driving, but we did look at some interesting insights from AI. So, an area of research that is being sort of developed as we speak, like really in the last year or two, is this notion of conversational intelligence. And when I say that, I'm not talking about like emotional intelligence or academic intelligence, but when we say conversational intelligence, we're getting away from like quantitative and qualitative research. At quantitative, oh, I can do the math and the numbers, or we have like a data set with surveys and responses. Qualitative, we're observing things or asking people what they think about things and so on. And we're looking at a natural experiment of hundreds of thousands of conversations financial planners and financial advisors are having with their clients, where essentially, there's now all these AI note takers and whatnot that are being used in meetings, and firms or advisors and professionals of other types too, lawyers, doctors, accountants, and so on, can opt into, in certain cases and in certain spaces, having the AI run essentially like sentiment analysis and linguistic analysis on their conversations, not at a client by client level where it's like, oh, well, when Daniel talks to Greg, Greg is always upset about this, and Daniel is always impatient about this or something. But just in the aggregate, right, when we look at the tone and tenor and nature of these enormous quantities of conversations, we can start to identify trends and commonalities. And so that's a kind of emerging area of research where there's some really interesting insights being found in the real world conversations of financial planners and their clients.
What kind of insights are we talking about?
I mean, there's some that are sort of direct. For example, there's sort of this thought that like AI is going to replace us, or AI is going to take our jobs, or it's going to make life so simple, so quick, so easy that we're all going to be working six minutes a week, and we'll all be fishing and lounging in the sun and drinking beers the rest of the week. But the number one use of AI in the financial planning space right now, across again a data set of tens of thousands of firms, is that they are using it to deliver higher quality client service and more expeditious client service. Those are the two primary functions that the vast majority of financial planners are using AI for. It's the number one thing is I've got a tool, the tool makes me better, faster, smarter. How do I use this to provide more value for my clients? That is the number one utilization. So none of us are really taking all the efficiencies and benefits of AI and using it to like make our lives better. We're immediately using it to make our clients' lives better instead.
Well, yeah, I mean, when I think about using AI at work, the last thing I think of is great. Now I can work 20 hours instead of 40 a week. I think my head goes to now I can spend more time doing the work I actually enjoy, right? Things like interactions with clients and potential clients, as opposed to manual data entry or note taking. What did they give any examples of direct ways that AI is improving things for clients, whether it's outcomes or efficiencies or just the process of things?
So the study there really looked not so much at the AI use or something like that. It really focused more on what happens in the conversation with clients. So the AI use part to this is just like a blanket takeaway of like what are planners doing with it? And the answer is we're using it to help people. Cool. But the practice components, like what it's showing us, for example, is that the average client of a financial planner comes into their meeting with their financial planner and in the first 5 minutes, based on their words, their questions, their actions, even things like like facial things, like some of these note takers are also doing video capture and are like looking at micro expressions and whatnot. But from these, what some of these are finding is that the essentially the average client sentiment on a scale of like 1 to 10, where 1 is like everything is awful and 10 is like euphoric, oh my God, life is just so incredible. The average client comes into a financial planning conversation at a 6.4 out of 10. So like they're a little happier than they are unhappy, but probably nothing spectacular. And the average client of a financial planner comes out of their meeting at a 7.5, which is not a dramatic change, right? We're going up 11% effectively, but that still shows, again, like, across these huge data sets, these large cohorts of information, that just the value of a conversation with a financial planner, even if we don't solve specific problems or issues, but just the discussion, just the quality of the conversation is improving clients' general happiness and well being just conversationally, let alone making them money, saving them taxes, doing anything like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because I think a couple episodes ago I said something along the lines of the fact that like clients don't always feel the need to meet with us because they recognize that we're doing the work on the back end regardless. And I think my takeaway from that was essentially I had that thought because we went from 4 meetings with clients per year on a scheduled basis to 3. And it's funny because like even now there are clients and occasions where I'm doing the preparation for a meeting, um, for the specific things we review during that time of the year. And I know just given the items, it might be a 15-minute conversation. And I sometimes get a little not worked up, but I'm like, oh man, like I feel bad making them come in. It's a 15-minute drive for them just to sit here for 15 minutes. And that's all I have. Want to talk about other aspects of their plan, I can do so. But in terms of scheduled, actual agenda items and action items that are needed from the conversation, it's 15 minutes. But you know, just because it's 15 minutes of measured, uh, you know, productivity from a financial perspective doesn't mean that there isn't something going on on a deeper level. Just having the conversation, right? They might go from a 6.4 to a 7.5, and in my head, it's like, well, we're really only checking this and that, but in their head, it's considerably more valuable than just the actual items that are on the agenda.
And I think that's sort of the meaningful thing. The some of the other insights that came out of the research just at scale, for example, like the most common topics, like what do clients want to talk about? What do people talk to financial planners about? The three most common topics that people want to talk to financial planners about are consolidation, right? I've got money over here, I've got accounts over there, I've got old retirement plans, whatever it is, and they want to talk about trying to get more organized there and kind of getting things unified. They want to talk about taxes. Hey, what is this costing me? What can I do to improve this? How can I pay less taxes? How can we have better lifetime tax bill and so on? The last thing is then just like investment strategy and income. And I think that that's probably biased or weighted to the fact that there's more people in or at retirement working with financial planners, but just this general interest in, hey, like I'm worried about the markets, I'm worried about conditions, whatever it is. How are we invested right now in light of the Strait of Hormuz issues or a COVID event or a change in the price of this or the closure of this company or the release of new technology, and how does that affect me? How does that affect the paycheck or the way that I live on and with this money?
Yeah, I wouldn't say any of those are particularly surprising to me. I feel like those are things that we talk about with clients a fairly decent amount. So that doesn't surprise me at all.
It wouldn't be a surprise then to hear what the most common fears or concerns are, which are running out of money, losing money in the market, the cost of taxes, and the cost of healthcare. Right, like these are all just like very common conversations that I think pretty much apply almost universally, right? I think every client is concerned about these in some way, shape, or form, or if not all of them, like 3 out of 4 are very, very normal. So those were insights where I'm like, okay, not surprising, but I guess it's good to know that it's not just our clients who have these concerns; it's everybody's clients.
You said and maybe this is just like getting into the nitty gritty of the wording too much, but you said fears, not concerns, and I was gonna ask, like, did they use fear? Because if somebody says they fear taxes, like, I'd be curious what they mean by that. Like, is it really just a fear of over like, realizing, "Holy crap, like, the last 20 years I've paid more than I should have. I could have avoided that?" And a fear of missing out on opportunity?
Think they didn't get into the detail in the presentation. If I had to make an educated guess based on how they were describing some of this stuff, it would be probably a fear that taxes are going to be out of control or that they're going to cost me too much. And too much, I think, is obviously a very relative, kind of values based or subjectively based statement. But it's not uncommon for us, right? Talking to a client who comes in or a potential client comes in who says, like, we're just paying a lot in taxes and I'm worried, I'm concerned, right? Just thinking, like, gosh, there's got to be a way to pay less taxes. Can you help me with that? So I think there's probably many manifestations of it, but they didn't get too much into the nitty gritty on the specifics of the fears other than just the labels they put on them, i.e., the running out of money, market losses, taxes, and so on.
Yeah, I think it even if just the value from AI is being able to capture some of these statistics and share it, in a presentation, it's worth its weight in gold, so I think there's some interesting stuff there.
Oh, certainly. Well, and again, the gold standard of research is natural experiments. It's watching people do what they actually do, or watching people say what they or listen to what people say when they don't think that their answer matters, because there's often a big gap between stated preference and revealed preference, right? Like you ask people, "Do you like to volunteer?" and like 99% of people say, "Yes, I like to volunteer." And then if you ask people in a different medium, like, "How often do you volunteer? How much do you volunteer?" or better yet, if you get into their calendars and see how much time they spend volunteering, suddenly, it goes from like 99% to like 20%. Like, most people don't volunteer actively or consistently in any significant sense. And so the same thing in these planning conversations. I mean, one thing we just ask clients, like, what are you concerned about? What are the planning things you want to help with? And they tell us things, and I bet most of these things would align, but there's a difference between what people will tell us and what people will do in these conversations. And so it's interesting, these are these trusted, intimate conversations between financial planners and their clients. And we're seeing it across the board because of this human experiment. These are such common topics and such common concerns.
So I'm sure this falls into that wasn't in the data conversation, but I'd be curious if a client went from a 6.4 to a 7.5 pre and post conversation, if they also were able to measure in any way the advisor and if their happiness changed at all as a result of having the conversation. But it's not related to this conversation, just honestly pure curiosity.
I bet if we sent them an email and said, "Hey, what do you think or what do you see there?" they might be able to pull that data. But to spend a little bit of time talking about how they structure the categorization and the classification of all the data points they were capturing. They didn't spend a huge amount of time on it. They just sort of like showed us a little bit behind the curtain. It's like, okay, it's not as easy as just asking the AI after the conversation, like what went well. Like there's a lot of nuance to how it interprets things that's sort of interesting.
Anything else on that topic?
No, I don't think on the AI side of things, but we had some fun with Big Beautiful Bill and values as organizations and teams. So there were a couple more interesting things that came up during the conference.
All right, let it rip.
Sure. I thought the values was an interesting one, and I don't want to. I don't think we'll belabor this topic too much. But there were presenters that sort of went over like firm values, right? Like we all work for these organizations or these teams, or we we're financial planners, we work in a firm together. But there's often a mistake, which is that sometimes values are written only for one audience. That is to say, they're written only for the internal team, and the internal version of values doesn't mean anything to clients or customers of an organization. Or they're written for clients and customers, but they don't tell the team anything about what to do. You might say like, "Oh, our values are like being, environmentally impactful, and we do that by being a very green company." And it's like, okay, that's client facing or consumer facing there, because clients or consumers might be looking for a green, eco friendly company, but that doesn't tell the team how we effectuate that. Is it in supply chain? Is it in policy? Is it in the vendors we select or don't select? How does that show up? And so they made the point that organizations would be well suited to have internally facing values and externally facing values. And they can be the same values, but you just don't want to describe your values to your team in the same way you describe them to clients and vice versa.
That's interesting because this presentation, I assume, is geared toward the financial planning community. And when I think about that, I think values would be more important to the team just because there's expectations that come along with certain, values and upholding them. Do you think it's that valuable to, and I'm not searching for a financial planner, so I don't know the answer to this, like how valuable is or are the values to potential clients?
I think they're enormously valuable to clients who think about it. I think it's easy to like go to, let's say, Target versus Walmart, but think about for a second the fact that though these are two companies that ostensibly do the same thing. Like they're superstores with a grocery section and clothes and shoes and electronics and video games and furniture and cleaning supplies. And there's a restaurant or a coffee shop or something baked in there somewhere. Like these are businesses that have fundamentally the same suites of products largely and the same kind of value proposition to the community largely. And yet there are Target people and there are Walmart people, right? Like in my household, we don't go to Walmart. We don't do it. And Caitlin and I have never discussed it. We don't say like we're not Walmart people or we hate Walmart, but there's something subconscious or subtle where we've decided that we are Target people. We're the people who are going to go to Target. We're not Walmart people. There's something in the values, something in the brand, something in the identity of the organization, where one attracts us and one repels us. Or one attracts us and one doesn't attract us, and so we're just sort of indifferent to the alternative. And I think the same thing can happen in financial planning firms. You might try to boil it down, the way that internet anonymous people do, and they say like, "Oh, financial planners, you're all the same. You just put money in the S&P 500 and charge 1%." And that's easy for people who don't know anything about it to say, but it's also not true in the slightest. There's an enormous variety and an enormous difference between firms in their style and their planning approaches and their investment approaches and how they charge, like all of that. And so I think, clients may not like if you ask clients what are you looking for in a firm, I don't think many would say value statements necessarily. Some would. They might say like, I'm a LGBTQIAP plus couple and we're going to look for a progressive firm that like believes in our humanity and our rights and supports us. Sure, that's a little bit more direct. But if you are sort of, John and Jane Smith with no particularly strong feelings about one thing or another, you may not care as much about values, but you might find at some point that you either strongly agree with or strongly disagree with a value that a company espouses because maybe you realize that their values do or do not align strongly with your own personal values.
Okay. So maybe a little reworking in the future for some of our values just to articulate that more to both, the team internally, but also to clients and people outward.
And as I think it's something we'll just want to work on. Like you and I could talk about what our values are right now and try to like articulate it, but I think it's a lot more meaningful for us to take the time to go on the website and go on the employee benefits guide and all of that and just round it out a little bit more. So that way it's more set in stone instead of just being a one podcast conversation out there in the ether that just tries to clarify everything in a hurry.
Cool. Well, I'm looking forward to it.
No? I mentioned One Big Beautiful Bill. We've talked about it before. We talked about it when it first passed last year, so we won't go over everything. But just as time has gone on, there's been some more guidance released on certain things, and so I think that's maybe a little bit helpful to touch on. Particularly, some of the stuff still is not live or active, but will be live and active soon. So I think the first one is going to be Section 530A accounts, which are colloquially branded as Trump accounts. I'm going to go with 530A accounts because I don't like the fact that it's a politicized thing. In the same way that I wouldn't like it if Roth IRAs were called like Obama accounts or Bush accounts. Like I think it's sort of disingenuous to try to ascribe positivity around a tax code or a tax policy to a particular politician. So in that sense, I'm just going to call these Section 530A accounts.
Sweet. You know what? You said I wouldn't want the Roth to be called like an Obama account, but wasn't Roth based off like a senator or somebody?
I mean, it was named after Senator Roth. I'm less concerned about that because I think Senator Roth is dead.
I
And
also
honestly,
I
like if
also
you ask me, was Senator Roth like a Republican or Democrat? I have no idea. It's aged enough now that I don't think it matters as much. It's sort of in the way you'd say like the New Deal was like an FDR thing back in the day. It's like, oh well, sure, FDR was like part of a political party, but like, do I care now? No. So I might not care as much about Trump accounts like 30 years from now as far as like the politics go. But today I'm gonna stay 538 to avoid people kind of going what based on their politics.
All right, so tell me about the 530A accounts.
Well, they're going to be available on July 4th, except July 4th is a Saturday, so they'll be available on July 6th. But they've picked the vendors. The record keeping back end is going to be run by BNY Mellon, which is a huge financial institution, and then Robinhood of all companies is going to be responsible for like the app, the user interface. So I'm sure it'll like look really cool, but it's a little bit strange. But they've clarified how contributions will work. They've clarified how some of the tax things will work. So this could be a little bit tricky to follow, so I'm going to try to break this down sort of piece by piece. So, first and foremost, a beneficiary has to be between the age of 0 and 18. So, you can open it for a young child, older child, but they have to be under the age of 18. And when we do that, we can then fund it one of four ways. So, the first way is I or a family member, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, anybody can make a gift into the account. Gifts into the account are not going to be tax deductible, so they are going to create a cost basis in the account, and you're going to start to put this together pretty quickly, Daniel. So I'll quiz you here in a second on what problem this might create. But putting money into it, if I put it as my a father to my son, that's going to be a non-deductible contribution, and it's going to create cost basis. At the same time, any business, public or private, can make up to a $2,500 contribution per employee, not per beneficiary. So earlier when I said 5,000 per beneficiary, if I have 5 kids, I could put 5,000 in for kid 1, kid 2, kid 3, kid 4, kid 5. I can put $25,000 away. If I'm an employer, I can put up to $2,500 into a or several Trump accounts, but it's $2,500 in the aggregate for that employee, right? So like if you, Daniel, are married and you have children, I could put $2,500 into an account for one of your children, or I could put $1,250 into an account for two of your children, or break it up 3 ways, 4 ways, 5 ways, whatever. That contribution is deductible by the business and is not income to the employee. So we have cost-based family contributions or friend contributions. We have no cost basis from business contributions. And then there's two other pieces, which is there's $1,000 of seed money for kids born between 2025 and 2028. And it's just sort of you sign up on the Treasury site and bam, they'll put the money in if the kid is born at the right time. And then finally, there's also a $250 gift from the Dell family, like of Dell computers. They donated $6 billion+ to this to put another $250 into accounts for kids who live in zip codes that have a median area income of $150,000 or less. So for any of our Longmont people here, good news: 80501, 80503, 80504. All of those have a immediate income of less than 150,000. So if you open a Trump account or a 530A account for your children, you will get the $250 from the Dell Foundation. And if they're born from 2025 or as late as 2028, then you will also get the $1,000 seed money from the federal government. And then annually, you can put in $5,000 and add to the cost basis, and your employer could put in up to $2,500 across all of your children on a deductible basis.
I'm glad they made it so straightforward.
Well, Daniel, can you imagine what problem might emerge if there's cost basis in a tax advantaged account?
Yeah, it's gonna create a problem for what's taxable versus what's not taxable, right?
It's essentially going to create sort of the pro rata problem that can exist in traditional IRAs. And it's important because Trump accounts are not IRAs, they don't fall into that category. So when we think about the traditional pro rata problem, where if you convert money from a pre tax IRA that has an after tax basis in it, then you have to do a ratio of that. if we keep 530A accounts outside of the IRA domain, then that pro rata prob doesn't exist for your child in the future. But you have the option with Trump accounts to convert a Trump account or 530A account into a traditional IRA. And you go, okay, well, Dan, you just articulated a bunch of problems or potential risks of doing that. So why would you do that? Excellent question. The core thing here is that making that conversion does open up the opportunity for you to do things like Roth conversions. So there's a world here where you could fund a child's 530A account from 0 to 18, put $5,000 in a year, and that's all going to be basis. The money that grows off of that will be tax advantaged and tax deferred. But let's say you put in $5,000 a year, you do this for 18 years, you put in $90,000. Let's say it doubled in that time, so you've got 90,000 of basis and 90,000 of interest. Well, in that scenario, you could do a Roth conversion of it, and yes, that will cause a $90,000 income event. But you might be doing that during their, let's say, college years, where they're in really low tax brackets, and it's not that big of a deal. And then suddenly they've got, $180,000 potentially minus taxes, although we should pay taxes with outside dollars. But you might have $180,000 in a Roth IRA at the age of 18. That's a pretty good head start on wealth building for a lifetime. So I mean, there's some definite value here and some definite potential benefits here. I think there's also some risks. You can only invest in an S&P 500 index fund, so you just gotta invest in America, whether you like it or not, whether you want to or not. Then the other piece here is just a question like, what is the purpose? There are no other accounts designed for children that are specifically designed for their retirement. So good news, bad news. Good news, now there's a retirement account or a retirement oriented account for children. Bad news, it's not good for much else. So, there's sort of a balancing of priorities here where if it's, safe for your kids' college, safe for your kids' retirement, you kind of need to weigh those options appropriately.
I don't hate the account though. I mean, I think it could have been designed a lot worse. Maybe Robinhood will, you know, add some feature that tracks basis for people so it can make their lives a little easier.
That is actually one of the fun things here is the law does not state who's responsible for tracking basis. So anybody who opens one of these accounts, do yourselves a favor and keep good transactional records of contributions so that you can calculate and keep track of your own basis data. As far as how you sign up for these, you can either file form 55 or 4547 as part of your taxes to opt into it. And if you don't get the reference, president, 45th president, 47th president. So they're again, they're being very on the nose here. Or you can go to trumpaccounts.gov and sign up for it.
I'll give them that. That's actually pretty clever. It's not bad.
Don't get me wrong, I don't like the politicalness of it, but they knew what they were doing. So, we'll give them credit where it's due, even if we don't like the credit they're getting.
That sounds like it's a pretty productive conference, though. Is there anything else from a high level we want to talk about here?
There's only one other topic I'll bring up here, which is just ERISA, Employee Retirement Income Security Act, and in particular, two things. One, they've sort of reduced the safe harbors that were in place under the Biden administration for environmentally, socially, governance products. So, if you want to invest in like green companies or progressive companies and use that as a criterion in your company retirement plan, that's riskier than it used to be. And simultaneously, they are introducing and proposing rules to create safe harbors for private equity funds and investments, where essentially employers can do less than adequate due diligence and not be held liable for it. Simple solution for two constituencies here. We help clients who own businesses run their retirement plans. I'll skip to the chase here and just say we're not going to advise you to put private equity in your plans. For clients, friends, listeners who are W 2 employees of other organizations or firms, I will just encourage a great deal of caution and skepticism about the future offering of private equity in plans and suggest that it would not be my first stop and that I would be highly skeptical of any offerings in private equity because they tend to be illiquid, expensive, and they tend to show really good risk reward metrics as far as like volatility and whatnot. But it's often a product of essentially the fund manager getting to say, like, my building this month is worth $2 million. Last month it was worth 1.9, and they're sort of making the number up because they're not investing in like Apple stock where they have by the second data about its value. They're just sort of like self appraising and self valuing stuff. And it can kind of create this like smoothing bubble in the performance numbers of private equity that don't actually work when you come to the point where you're going to sell out of it or get out of it because you were making up the numbers and that's great. But at the end of the day, it's only worth what somebody will actually pay you for it.
Yeah, I've tried to wrap my head around good cases for individuals investing a considerable amount of their qualified assets in a sector like private equity. And maybe I'm just not creative enough, but I tend to struggle in coming up with ideal scenarios. I think it's one of those things that just sounds entertaining and could be like for the employer, it's good to say, "Oh, we have this new hot fund option, and we care about you so much that we offer it." But for employees, like I don't see it as a win. I just see it as more noise. And
Just a side comment. This is not the same presentation, but at one point during the conference, David Booth, who's the founder of Dimensional Funds or one of the founders of Dimensional Funds, was presenting, and he just made a comment, which was, I would be very skeptical of private equity because you need to ask yourself a fundamental question: why would an asset class that was only being held by sovereign wealth funds then flow down to endowments, then flow down to institutional funds, then flow down to financial advisors, and then flow down to retail investors? Right? Like if it's such a good product, if it's so valuable, and there's no necessity that it be in the public markets because it is private markets, and it's so great, why would the sovereign wealth funds and the endowment funds and so on be looking to sell their existing ownership of these assets to retail investors? And, there's a little bit of conspiratorial thinking that goes in that question, but it's sort of like well, hold on, if it's so great, why are you trying to sell it to me kind of question. And we've already started to see some cracks in that. Like the private credit market right now is going through some stuff. And we don't use private credit with our clients, but I mean, there are articles about some funds going through like 30-40% redemptions where, investors are essentially panicking and running for the exits. And that can be a thing that happens in private markets because again, it's less liquid, it's less transparent, and bad things can happen there.
yeah, I think that's an interesting way to think about it, and a good way to approach it with a healthy degree of skepticism.
I think it's probably a good way of putting it. So,
All right.
in my absence this week, anything you've learned or that you care to share with the audience as a takeaway?
I think I would just say or reiterate one of the points you honestly just made on the podcast here today that I kind of came to the conclusion of, which is literally just the fact that like you don't always need an hour's worth of material for a meeting to make it productive. Sometimes just holding that space for people to have the conversation, right? Even if it's like you said earlier, right? Some spouses maybe don't talk about money and it's something they need to be more proactive about as opposed to reactive. Like there are a ton of clients we have that come into meetings and say, "This is really the only time, the two of us actually talk about this." And that's not a bad thing. It's actually a great thing because we provide that space and it allows them to have those conversations. And I don't think that's something we measure per se when we talk about like client outcomes or something you could put on a website, but I don't think that doesn't mean it's not valuable.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of these subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.